All right, George, welcome to the show, man. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, man. Thanks so much for having me, Greg.
Absolutely. Well, I actually found it. You reached out to me, but then before that even happened, I listened to you as a guest on somebody's show. I think I was like, this is kind of funny, but I was training for the New York Marathon and I had a lot of time to kill as I'm running for 20 miles. And
Yeah.
I typed in on Spotify one day, like squatter, because I'm always fascinated with like squatter situations just because I'm a nerd. And what you were talking about like blew my mind. This is going to be a great topic. And we'll also cover title fraud today as well, which is fascinating and horrendous.
Oh, yeah. You want to get some good podcast time in, train for a marathon. That's the way to go.
Exactly. That's what I figured, and it still was hellacious to finish the day of the marathon.
How'd you do? How did you do in that marathon?
I finished it. It was
Hey,
4 hours and 52 minutes, and
hey, man, you got across the finish line. You got a
I got
time.
it.
Good for you.
Yeah, it's funny. I trained pretty hard for it, but the night before, for some reason, I decided to eat like dairy as part of my meal. I didn't think it was in the pasta, but it was.
Mm.
And after mile 14, my stomach was like a pretzel, so that slowed me down a little bit. But
At
the
least you
finish
didn't
was
shit
fun.
yourself. That's a real thing. That
Oh
definitely
yeah,
happens.
yeah, for sure. I was like limping. It looked like a galloping horse all the way to the finish line. So it was a great podcast. I got a lot out of it. I'm really excited to interview you on this show about these details. So let's just start out with your background, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a 22-year real estate investor. It's crazy to say that at this point, but yeah, it's I've been in the game for a while doing everything from buy and hold, flips, ground up new construction, building luxury homes. Right now I'm building apartments in the Portland area. I own rentals in a few different states, Idaho and Texas and Oregon. Nothing in Washington, but give it time. And I'm building some warehouses right now, so I've done a lot of things. I've got a real ADHD problem in the real estate business. I'm always doing some darn thing. And the latest thing started Super Bowl Sunday when I posted the I Stole a House video, and that was the video that kind of changed everything. And I've been on this side quest for the past, oh gosh, what has it been, like 9 months at this point, educating people about squatters and deed fraud. But basically, the video garnered tens of millions of views, landed me like on Fox News, Dr. Phil, News Nation. They talked about me on Joe Rogan, and it really just sent everything into a spiral. And ever since then, I ended up becoming like a repository of information all about like squatters and deed fraud. And even though I'd never even heard of deed fraud before I went viral, I learned all about it, really started digging into it. So now I'm on a mission to save the assets of guys like Greg and guys like George.
That's amazing, and that's crazy. You went viral like that. What was it like, kind of being on some of these big outlets?
Really surreal, man. Like the whole thing really taught me a lot about like, just how virality works and then also like how mean and nasty people can be. I got like death threats and
Are
stuff. It
you
was
serious?
Oh yeah, no. People thought that I actually
What?
did steal the house, that I was the squatter. I'm like, dude, just click on my profile. I'm so Googleable. Like you can see I'm one of the good guys here. But either way, no, it was wild. Like everybody that I've ever met was emailing, calling, texting me and saying like, "Hey, look what my grandma just sent me." And it's like, I know that guy. And this continued for months, man. Like it's still to this day, like I will be like recognized at like real
Dude,
estate meetups,
that's
be like,
so
"Hey,
cool.
aren't you the guy from the video?" And it's pretty surreal because I've done a lot of things in my career, but not any of them have ever like garnered me like any level of fame whatsoever. And it's a curious mix of fame and infamy at the same time because there's still some people that think that I actually stole a house. And if you ask Chat GPT, they know who I am at this point, and they'll say, no, George McCleary did not actually steal a house. So I like to say that common sense has prevailed.
That is true. That is true. So have you gotten stopped like at the airport yet, being like, "Oh my God, you're that squatter guy from video"?
No, I'm not. I'm not like, in the movies, or I'm not a rapper or anything. This is really just like real estate investors and
Yeah, yeah,
people
yeah.
like nerds like us, basically.
Got it. You're like a niche celebrity, we call that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not so bad. If I was ever going to land in a space, I could have done far worse.
Totally, man. So you're on this mission now to help educate and prevent people from squatting. Let's cover that topic first, then we'll cover deed fraud second. So
Yeah.
if someone's not familiar with the concept of squatter, I mean, they probably are living under a rock considering now it's 2024. What is a squatter? What is that general definition?
So a squatter differs from a holdover tenant or a non-paying tenant in one very important distinction. It's that they never had the right to be there in the first place. So a squatter is a person who's occupying a property and they're not supposed to be there. They have no lease, they got no nothing. And I started digging into this and made the video about it because in my city of Portland, Oregon, and also in your city of Seattle, it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And if you try and go the conventional route of kicking them out via the court system, it's going to be a slog, man. You're going to be there for like a year, 2 years, or longer just because the way that landlord tenant law has been written. And there's landlord tenant law like literally everywhere in the country and actually the world also. There's squatter problems. Like people wrote me after this video, like from Romania and stuff. And what happened was I just started hearing all their stories, just talking to people because like I said, everybody in the world was emailing me and texting me, and they're like, "Hey, man, you won't believe what happened to me with my squatter." I'm like, "Let's Zoom, let's talk about it." And I heard, dude, the craziest shit you've ever heard in your life. And a lot of it was very kind of like off record. And they're like, okay, well, I'll tell you how I did it, but you can't tell anybody. And I'm like, well, how about I just don't tell them it was you? And he's like, oh, yeah, okay, that works. So then I hear how people have unconventionally gotten rid of squatters. I'm like, okay, people need to know this. And so I just assembled it all. And that's when I made the Squatter Defender course.
Dude, that's awesome, man. And especially like where you and I both live and where I'm from and where we do most of our business, the New York area, these anti-landlord areas where it really does cause an issue when you have a lot of these squatter problems when someone's breaking into a property. And like you mentioned in the other podcast, and I'm sure in your course, like they make a fake lease. The cops come and they're like, well, this is a civil matter. And then next thing you know, like it could take a year to get them out. And now that's a flip that you were going to sell. And now you're paying hard money for 12 months. You have to file an extension. They could fuck your property up. It's a serious issue.
They fuck your property up every single time,
Yeah.
invariably. When you've got somebody that has no responsibility for a space whatsoever and they're on the fringes of society, like willfully committing crimes and squatting in properties, they're not going to take care of the property. And so we spoke actually before we start recording about our friend Leica, a Seattle resident. Her place got trashed to the tune of like 70 grand or something like that.
Yeah.
And Leica's scenario was almost like a best case scenario for Seattle. She got them out in a matter of like, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks. But just within that short time span, dude, they completely trashed the place. They'd ripped out like cabinets and floors. They had animals living there that were pissing on the ground. Like that's a huge line item in the expense column of squatters. And you never hear about that on the news, but it's between of all the cases that I studied and heard from people nationwide, it was between about 50 and 100 grand was about where these things landed every single time.
That's insane. And that's not covered in an insurance policy, most likely.
You can get part of it sometimes with quote unquote vandalism, but you really got to kind of
Interesting.
game the system a little with that.
Yeah.
And a lot of adjusters are like, this isn't vandalism. There's just someone living here and trashing the place. And then you're SOL.
Exactly, and then, like, the lender doesn't care, they just wanna keep making their interest checks. So you're down in Portland, which is, like, I would say Seattle Junior, as you said. Is this still a very prevalent thing, or now that you've kind of made this more public and there's a lot more awareness of it, like, you've seen it kind of diminish over time? Because this really was, like, probably peak in what, 2020, 2021, kinda.
It's really impossible to figure out when it's going up or going down other
Yeah,
than, you got press coverage of it happening in individual cases, but there's no stats on this. People say like, "Hey, what are my chances of being squatted?" And I'm like, there's nowhere else to
yeah,
look other than, but if you hang out in any real estate community, you're going to have landlords and the real estate communities are usually made up of people with like multiple properties, but the fact is most rental homes are owned by people that own less than 4 properties. So they're not going to real estate meetups. They just have a rental property or two because they didn't sell their starter home. They kept it as a rental. And
yep,
so I talked to enough people to know that it's gotten worse because squatters and criminals use the internet just like we do. They figured out that they can commit this crime with impunity. It's more valuable than it ever has been in the history of time because housing is more expensive now than it ever has been. So when you're stealing a $3,000 a month house, it's completely different than when you could get an apartment for 500 bucks. So it's more lucrative, not getting held accountable for it. So if you want to commit this crime, you're probably not going to get in trouble for it. So that's why it keeps getting worse.
yeah, and as well, like, someone who's gonna squat, most likely they don't have anything to lose, so it's like you get a default judgment or just a judgment against this person for, $50,000. If they don't have anything, like, the judgment's worthless.
It's worthless, basically.
100%. Let's walk through a squatter case study right now on something that's actually happened in the real world, and we'll use that as an example, and then we'll teach some lessons through that story.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So I got contacted by a lot of people, and the things that stick out the most are so Squatter Defender, that online course that I offer, it's squatter protection, detection, and ejection. And the protection and detection, those are less exciting. This is like, how to
Yeah.
fortify your house, how to prevent it and everything. And so that's super important because, as we all know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But really, it's the ejection part. That's where everybody, wants to know exactly, like, how do you get rid of these fuckers? Like, what's the best way to do it? And the unfortunate answer is there's no like perfect method. There's no one size fits all method. There's cash for keys, which makes you want to vomit because who wants to pay off a squatter? Then there's going through the court system, and there's some places where that actually does make sense. If you're like in some like rural county in Arkansas where they can kick out a tenant in like an hour and a half after the judge hears it down like next to the local dairy, then yeah, that's exactly the route you should go because it's
Yeah.
not going to be expensive and the system is set up to have, the sheriff right there. But if you live in Seattle, if you live in Portland, and even places like within red states, there's a big backlog of evictions and very robust landlord tenant law that is going to take you months. And so that's probably not your best bet. So then you get into what I call in the Squatter Defender course the unconventional solutions. And I've got a lot of favorites from those. And, I can never mention like who actually did it, but, and every time I got permission to say what people did. And it's everything from kicking in the door and making it look like there was forced entry and then calling the cops and saying, "Hey, look, this guy broke into the house," even though
Mm.
it was the
Yeah, yeah,
homeowner
yeah,
that
that's
actually did
interesting.
it. Like smashing the windows. And then there's just rendering the place uninhabitable. And the way that people do that sometimes is really hilarious. One guy, he had somehow had access to a large quantity of snakes, and so he filled the house with snakes, and
God.
the squatters did not want to live among the snakes, and so they took off. And another guy with, I think they were like, speaking of snakes, what do they eat? Mice, and so you can
Nice, yeah.
buy mice, you can buy crates of them. So he filled the house with mice, and squatters were not living very cleanly, so the mice were having a heyday. So they're filling the house with, animals or something, but if I had to pick a favorite, it would be this one. It's filling the house with people, actually. That's squatting on the squatter. There's actual squatter removal services. I've befriended a couple of them where you basically hire a guy or hire some guys to move in. They move in with the squatters, and they are very, very bad roommates. They cover the house with cameras, and let's just suffice it to say, they're just really terrible roommates, and the squatters don't wanna live there anymore amongst these people, and if they call the cops, these people that you moved in have the same rights as
It's
the
the squatters'
squatters.
rights, it's like reciprocation, basically.
Yeah, yeah, it's fighting fire with fire, basically.
Interesting. It's a double whammy at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So you got one guy saying like, "Hey, this is my place. I have this lease," and you got another guy saying like, "Hey, this is my lease." So the real scam is when the cops show up because that's what everybody does. But then when the cops shows up, if there is somebody that says like, "Yeah, here's my lease. As you can see, I've moved in all of my stuff," then the cop's going to say like, this seems like a dispute between you guys. I can't haul this guy out, by the nape of the neck and throw him out on the street because." Possession's 9/10 of the law. The shirt on your back is presumed to be your own unless you can prove otherwise. So it's a civil case. Same with squatting on the squatter. You move some guys in there. So these guys are specialized. They wear like bulletproof vests and stuff like that because squatters are desperate people. But essentially, the whole thing happens all over again if the squatters call the police. They say like, "Hey, sorry, but same as you have the right to be here, so does he." And so that's essentially how it works.
I think that is the best way to do it because if someone's willing to do that and, take that risk, it's like that squatter knows at that point that the loophole that they used is getting used against them. And
Exactly.
there's most likely another property they can do that to. It's interesting.
Mhm.
I got a friend in Long Island. I won't mention his name, but what he said this happened probably 3 or 4 times. What he does is he goes in there like a lunatic at 6 in the morning and he rings the doorbell like a madman. And these squatters are obviously sleeping there and they're not up at 6 in the morning, most likely doing their morning routines. He goes
Nice.
in there with a baseball bat and he starts smashing the house. He starts hitting the walls, he hits the lamps, and he says, "The next thing I'm hitting is your head if you don't get the fuck out," New York style. And the squatters usually get the hell out. And he's done that successfully like 3 times.
So what your friend did is pretty common.
Yeah.
You go in there and there's baseball bats, then there's actually like pulling your squatters out at gunpoint. That's what everybody like in the comments of the I Stole a House video, they all would say, "Yeah, if this ever happened to me, I would just, grab a gun and like, I would solve
Yeah.
this problem real quick." And so they're basically like suggesting that they would either kill the squatter by shooting them or escort them out at gunpoint. And so the problem with that is
Not a
that
good idea. That's a terrible idea.
yeah, it's you open yourself up for like retaliation and you've got more to lose than the squatters. I
Exactly.
guarantee it. Otherwise, you wouldn't own a house. And there's actually plenty of documented cases where the squatter has been killed and the homeowner is held liable for it.
The
They're
squatter shouldn't die because they broke into a house. They should just get removed from the house.
Yeah, but, like, the most important thing is if you're a homeowner and, maybe you're a firearms aficionado or you're a tough guy or whatever, it's still not a great idea because the squatters can be armed as well, and, like, bad things can happen. If people are held at gunpoint, they can get pretty desperate, and
100.
there's been plenty of cases where the owners have been killed by the squatters. It actually
Oh my
happened in New York, and it's really tragic every time. So between the liability and then also the possibility that you could be hurt or killed, that's why I really just am a big advocate of like, yeah, consult and hire a professional. That's your best
100%.
route. Yeah.
100%. What about utilities? Like they might have a fake lease that they could pull off of like eforms.com, but what if you show them the deed and then the utilities being like, the Puget Sound energy bills in my name? Could they in theory get thrown out from the utilities not being in their name?
Yeah, yeah. So part of the scam is putting the utilities in your name. A lot of times, they'll skip a step and they won't put the utilities in their name. But the biggest thing by far is just sort of like the visual presentation. The cop shows up, they've got a guy who's standing in like a completely empty house with like a broken door frame. Like, okay, there's a pretty good chance that this guy gets his name. He's got all these convictions. Probably we got a bad actor over here. But a lot of times they walk up to the house and the guy's like moved in his furniture and he's got all his friends living there, and it actually looks like he's the legal inhabitant. And so, if the utilities aren't in his name, I mean, not every rental agreement has a provision to put the utilities in their name. It's up to the discretion of the cop at that time. And especially today, with a lot of anti cop sentiment, they're not going to want to stick their necks out and run the risk of pulling somebody out of their home when they actually have the right to be there, because
Yeah, that's the
again,
problem.
the shirt on your back is presumed to be your own unless someone can prove otherwise very convincingly right off the bat.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny. I actually had a squatter situation in Texas, like a random wholesale deal. It's still going on, believe it or not. But Houston, believe it or not, it was hard to get the squatter out. We had to pay them to get out. I think we paid them like 2,500 bucks or something, and they got out. The house was vacant for 10 years, and someone just moved in, and no one was making a fuss out of it until we went to go lock it up. So, I mean, a lot of these houses, like when they're like in a Houston, it's a cheaper market. Like you have a lot more abandoned properties there that are like, worth maybe 150 grand fixed up. And these people who don't have a home, they're like, fuck it, I'll just stay in this house. It's been vacant for 10 years. But yeah, it costs money to get that person out. And then on the other hand, there was another one, and it was a wholesale deal in Issaquah that I didn't end up buying because the attorney said it's going to take at least 9 months. And I said, fuck that. And this could happen in good neighborhoods, bad neighborhoods. Like Issaquah is pretty rich. Houston, this neighborhood was pretty bad. So it doesn't really matter where it is. It just matters about the fact that you got a squatter involved.
Oh, yeah, yeah, no, it can really happen anywhere, and I get people from red states all the time saying like, "Oh, hey, this is never gonna happen in my neighborhood," or whatever, and it's like, yeah, don't be so certain about that." There it
Yeah.
really happens everywhere nationwide, but, like, is it worse in, like, blue states and blue areas? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, for the most part, it is, but it still represents, like, a massive inconvenience, and it could really impact your bottom line, really, no matter where you are, and that guy who was in there squatting that property you paid off to the tune of 2,500 bucks, that's actually getting off pretty cheap. Like, a lot of times, the squatters will game the system, and it'll be like 10,000, 20,000. There's a
Oh,
squatter
yeah.
in LA that wanted 100 grand because it's commensurate with the value of the property, what the rent would be, and how bad the person wants them out and how difficult it is to get them out by conventional means.
It's crazy. So as we start to conclude squatters, I want to transfer over to the deed fraud, which is fascinating.
Oh,
If
yeah.
people want to check the squatter course out, what is the best way for them to check that out online?
Squatterdefender.com is where you wanna go, and then if you put in a promo code, your listeners can get 20% off by using the promo code GREG, Greg.
Look at that. Squatterdefender.com. Put the code Greg in there, get 20% off, and learn how to fight them squatters.
Oh, and the sticker price is 199. It's 199 bucks, so it becomes like 159 bucks, so pretty good.
That's a bargain compared to how much it would cost if you got to deal with a squatter.
And since we're segueing into title fraud, it actually comes with a free year of Title Fraud Defender, which is that crime that I had never heard about until one day. After I posted the video, I was talking to a guy. He said, "Hey, my squatter was pretty sophisticated. He changed the name on the deed to himself." I'm like,
Holy
"He
shit.
yeah, that's what I said." I'm like, "For real? How did he even do that?" And it's like, "Well, it turns out it's really simple. You just hand the deed with like a fake notary stamp to the county recorder and they just record it." I'm like, "Really? They do that?" So I looked into it, talked to title people, did some research, found like the preeminent deed fraud lawyer down in California and talked to him about it. I'm like, "Does this really happen?" So I just started going down this rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And then I started looking up cases because occasionally there would be a news story on it. And then I found out that this was happening more and more. And it was happening on land in Florida, then like on mansions in LA. And I'm like, this is insane. Like this steals the equity. You can steal the equity in a house just by like filing a deed. And it turns out not only can you do that, but then you can resell the house and pocket all that sweet equity and turn it into crypto and, move to Europe and
Yeah,
and
retire.
retire.
So let's break that down on the mechanics of doing that because it's interesting. So we have a person who wants to commit deed fraud. You mentioned the notary, the deed, and the fake stamp. How does that work?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned title insurance
Yeah.
because there's a perception out there that that protects you from title fraud, and the reality is, unfortunately, it does not. And
Wow.
the reason for
Oh,
that
yeah.
is so break out one of your closing statements, and chances are the title policy that you bought for your property is an Alta owner's policy,
Yep.
and that protects you from the policy date from when you bought the property to the past. So if
Got it.
there's a painter that didn't get paid 10 years ago or whatever, like they take care of it if they miss that. But what it doesn't cover is stuff that happens after you buy the property, after the policy date. So fraud and impersonation is not covered under the Alta owner's policy after the policy date. So if you call up your title company after you've been title frauded, they're going to say, "Ooh, you have an owner's policy and you're SOL." But there is a policy that does cover fraud and impersonation, but as you'd imagine, it's a lot more expensive. So most people and even title agents don't even know it exists. But occasionally you will see people buying it, but it's called, gets a little confusing, the homeowner's policy. The homeowner's policy. If you go to the Alta website, there's the owner's and the homeowner's policy, and the little check boxes about what it does. And about halfway down, the homeowner's policy continues with more coverage. But like most people don't even know what title insurance even does, let alone like, why would you pay for more coverage when you're already, getting fleeced for like 1,500 bucks or whatever? Why would you pay half again more or double it up when you're not even really sure what it does in the first place? This is for your common home buyer. So, because of that, most people are completely uninsured and completely vulnerable to it.
So someone's going and doing this. They want to commit the deed fraud. So they
Yeah.
go and they get a fake ID, I'm assuming. This is probably step one, right?
So there's a couple of ways to do it, but the most popular are impersonation. So the property is owned by Greg. I go on the dark web and I get a fake ID with my mug on it that says your name on it. And
Okay.
then I go, "Hey, real estate agent or wholesaler, I'm selling this property." And they're like, "Okay, Greg, sounds great." And I sell the place. And if I've stolen your identity, I've got your social and everything, I can open up a bank account. A lot of times the bank accounts are already like pre-opened. So you can buy these on the dark web. Or sometimes they'll just buy someone's fake identity and it'll be like, John Miller or something like that. And they'll just find a guy named by that name. It's like, okay, we got a guy in Utah named John Miller. And so then they impersonate him and then they sell the house. They run title and everything. And so the ID is a perfect match. So they don't even have to invest in like a fake notary stamp. So there's impersonation, or the more sophisticated way is to actually steal the identity of really just like anybody with a social and a bank account. And then you deed the property out of Greg's name and into the fake name. So then, like, the world is your oyster at that point. You can sell it to anybody, and that person is going to run title when they buy it. So the end buyer from the wholesaler or someone that you've conned into buying the property, they're of course going to go through title,
Sure.
and they close on the place, and then your fake name that you've opened the bank account in, they get wired the proceeds. So then the end buyer, that guy has title insurance, so he's going to be okay. But who's not okay is the guy
The guy who
who
got
got his
his
equity
deed stolen.
stolen.
How common is this?
It's not extremely common, but it's growing like crazy. And the reason is that it's extraordinarily lucrative and pretty difficult to get caught if you actually know your ass from your elbow. If you
Yeah.
just know how to like use a fake ID and you know how these things, deeds and title policies and everything work to just a very like elementary extent, then yeah, you can pull it off. And the entirety of someone's equity, especially if the place has been paid off,
Yeah.
that's normally the places that people are targeting. A lot of times they'll be like land in Florida or something like that. It's totally paid off.
Yeah.
That's been a huge target because there's rarely debt on it. Because otherwise, you
Yep.
got a mortgage company saying like, "Oh, hey, did you pay this off?"
Is that a
And
little harder if it's on an LLC?
no, because the county recorders, they just get the piece of paper saying, like, the person signing on behalf of the LLC, the county recorder doesn't look at your operating agreement. They
That's
don't look
true.
up the registered agent. They just like, okay, I see a signature. It's going from, Hellbeck LLC over to, George's fake name LLC or just my name. And they're
Interesting.
like,
Yeah.
all right, it's got grantor, it's got grantee, legal description, property address. Okay, look, oh, where's the notary stamp? Oh, there it is. There's my security measure. And then they record it.
That's crazy, man. It's so scary, especially people that have, let's say they have hundreds of rental houses. It's hard to manage hundreds of rental houses in terms of knowing what's going on with the title at any given point. You created a
Yeah.
software to help with this process. What is that software called?
So it's called Title Fraud Defender, and basically what it does is so if you wanna know if someone's stolen your title, you can go to your
Yeah.
county page and just refresh it every morning with your morning
Yes.
coffee and see if it's changed ownership, and if it has, then you know something's wrong, but
Yes.
nobody wants to do that. So I found out there is a company that does this called Home Title Lock, but they charge you $20 a month, and I'm thinking to myself like, "Dang, I've used a lot of, like, real estate data and stuff and all, like, my real estate investing and everything, like, this is just not that expensive. I feel like I could do this better and I could do it cheaper with, like, better technology." Turns out I could. So I hired a software development company, and we created and basically just the state of the art title monitoring system so that it's just constantly monitoring it, and if it ever gets changed or tampered with, it notifies you right away. And so if you know about it a year from now, your equity's gone, you're completely fucked. But
Yeah.
if you know about it the very next day or like a week later, there's not enough time for the person to find an M buyer, bring it to title, have title clear, and close the thing. You and I both know it takes like a few weeks to actually make all
Oh,
that
yeah.
stuff happen. So what you do then is you got to fix the title, which actually takes a lawsuit. It's an action to quiet title, but you haven't suffered any real damage in terms of your equity being stolen. You've gotta do the lawsuit and you gotta jump through the hoops, and the guy who stole it's not gonna show up to court because
No, no.
hello. So it's open and shut. It takes a minute. It's gonna cost you a few grand, but like, yeah, if you know about it quickly, the damage is, this much. It's minuscule. But if you
Yeah.
don't know about it, then you're completely fucked.
Yeah,
So
your equity is gone. It's interesting you're saying that because I had a situation now that you mentioned that where there was an abandoned house in the area that I grew up in. And I was about to lock a deal down. This was like maybe 5 months ago or 6 years, about to lock a deal down. It was vacant. Turns out there was a squatter inside, right? Squatter was in there. It was an estate, so it was an inherited property. So the
yeah.
person who I reached out to, who was the legitimate heir, goes over there to see that there was a squatter. The squatter went haywire on the guy. The guy was like, "I'm getting the fuck out of here."
Oh boy.
Turns out I ended up calling a title company because he was getting like some notice, and the squatter was about to fucking get the deed recorded in their name through a fake ID. Turns out because I called the title company, they stopped the sale. Now there's this huge FBI investigation. And he said,
Oh
whenever
wow.
this thing gets resolved, I'm selling you the house at a great price. And the way that we found this out was that the lady who was the owner on record is deceased. This was the son I was dealing with.
Yeah.
They sent a fake ID of her like birth year being like 1943, which would have mean she was like whatever, 80 years old. But
Yeah, yeah.
turns out she was born in the 20s. And I was like, yo, that's a fake ID. They're committing fraud. And then they fucking caught it right in the nick of time. Once it actually like settles and like this thing gets resolved, I'll reach back out to you and I'll give you the whole breakdown of it.
I really need the epilogue on that, like how everything
Oh yeah.
actually ended up
Yeah. I'll tell
shaking
you the
out.
whole thing. I'll make a little case study or something. I'll send
Because
you.
you'll read these news stories where like you'll hear just that, like here's what happened, and this is really crazy. But then there's never like a follow-up, like, hey, remember
Oh,
that lady who got her title stolen? Like, oh, here's how it got fixed. And most of the time, like the guy was never caught. And if he ever was, he was like the stupidest dude in the world who put the title in his own name.
yeah, exactly. But this happens, and people think New York, because New York is an attorney state, like
Mhm.
it's usually harder to do it in New York because there are lawyers. But this was in New York, and I'm like, it could happen anywhere. It doesn't have to be in a title state or an attorney state. It's the same shit. You got to get a title policy. There's title companies in New York. It's the same, process. But you do have a lawyer on most of these deals that kind of represent the buyer and seller. So it's not like in Portland or Seattle where you just take it to title and escrow and they close it. But I'll let you know what ends up happening on that
Yeah,
one.
let
But
me know how that ends up
stuff
happening.
happens.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
crazy.
man. I mean, but at the
So
end of the day, like, you can either pay 20 bucks a month for home title lock, and what I'm doing at Total Title Fraud Defender, it's like a maximum of, like, I think 5 or 6 bucks if you have just,
a
like, 1
month?
property. Yeah, per month.
Oh my
But if
God.
you've got, like, a big portfolio, most of our signups are actually investors who have multiple properties, and if you have multiple properties, it gets knocked down to, like, 2 bucks a month or something per door. And so,
Yeah,
it's just so much more cost effective for people with portfolios, and so that's why I end up talking to real estate investors most of the time about it.
100%. What's that website called?
TitleFraudDefender.com. And that same promo code of Greg, Greg, will get you that 20% off.
Beautiful. We'll put that in the show notes as well. So the two action items I wanted to put in the show notes is the first website is what's the squatter course called?
SquatterDefender.com, and the other one's Title Fraud Defender. We're the Defender Network.
You are the Defender Network. You're preventing these people from getting hosed one property at a time, man.
I'm
And
defending real estate investors.
defending real estate, the people's person for real estate investing. That's
Yes, sir.
my man George. Well, listen, man, it was a pleasure talking with you today. If people want to follow you online, what is the best way for them to follow you?
So I'm very searchable. George McCleary, McCleary Realty and Development. You can find me easily by just Googling your platform of choice and my name, George McCleary. The course is at squatterdefender.com. That'll teach you all about squatter prevention, detection, and ejection. And then Title Fraud Defender. Go check that out if you've got any property that you don't want your equity stolen. Don't wait until the problem gets worse. It's already bad enough. And it's a life insurance policy that you really wish that you had when you lose all your equity in your house. So
Totally.
yeah, find me on social, and if you got a crazy deed fraud or squatter story, like, I still wanna hear it, and I love hearing about it, plus it just helps me be a more valuable resource on the subject the more I hear about it. So, yeah, hit me up and, let me know what happened to you.
Awesome. George, it was a pleasure having you on the show, man. We'll make sure all it's in the show notes and we'll talk soon, man.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Greg.